think through what is the best possible among the options that were offered to us. Had we not had that week, had we not had the genius of the photo interpreters who told us what these scratches in the ground were, and had to make an immediate decision, very likely we would have made exactly the wrong decision, exactly what the Joint Chiefs ultimately urged, which was to strike militarily against Cuba. And as Bob says, we now know that would have brought both a strategic nuclear response from those missiles and a tactical nuclear response from the Soviet forces on the island of Cuba.
Okay, so let's underline the point and see agree or disagree. Okay, your proposition, which I think is a very important proposition, is if you had to make these decisions, if this group had made these decisions in 24 or 48 hours, rather than with a week of deliberation, you believe that you would have attacked, yes? And that you think the consequences of that, given what we didn't know, as Bob said, but given what was the reality, would likely have been the use of nuclear weapons against the United States. Yeah?
I do.
The proposition.
Yes.
You agree? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Ernest?
Yes, I want to pick up for just a moment on what was just said, because it seems to me that one of the important and very difficult lessons from the crisis is that it did take time. It took time for people to work out the possibilities, to see options that they didn't see, even for President Kennedy to cool down, because he was prepared in the initial sessions to resort to an immediate attack. And I say it's a difficult lesson because there is almost no chance that any president of the United States will have that leisure to deal with the crisis in future. And the importance of presidents and their advisors internalizing the lesson from this crisis that David Gergen was articulating to some students a couple of nights ago, that presidents just must not allow themselves to be hustled by the media into premature decisions. Just say, I've got to think about the question.
Well, particularly for the Neiman Fellows who are here and others who are part of the Schoenstein Center for the Press, I've often reflected on just this point and have come to the same conclusion. Today, when you have a crisis, and David has seen this, or all of us have, I saw in the Clinton administration, comes a crisis, one of their earliest questions is how long do we have to decide, by which they mean how long before this becomes public? And the answer is never, that I know, more than 48 hours, and frequently it's less than 48 hours. So roll this back into the lesson that you've drawn.
But Graham, I think the lesson is don't decide until you're ready to decide. And people say to me, well, McNamara, surely you don't think an administration could handle it this way today with them. There'd be leaks and in 24 hours it'd be done. I will accept that. But I will not accept that therefore the president and his advisors should be forced to come to a decision that may involve the life and death of this country before they've had the time to think through the alternatives. And this is what Kennedy insisted on. He said, I want you to stay here and I want you to be here and think about this 24 hours a day until you have come to a consensus on A, what the problem is, B, what the alternative solutions are, and C, what you think we should do. And it took a week. It literally took a week of almost 24 hours a day. And I would suggest that had it been on the front page of the newspaper the first day, it would have been hard as hell to take that week. But a president should be strong enough to say to the American people, we've got a problem, we're going to have to think it through, I'm not prepared to act yet. Now, I know that sounds naive, but if you're facing the risk of nuclear war, and I want to come back to whether we do or don't face that risk now, if you're facing the risk of nuclear war, my God, you've got to do that. And you have to start, we haven't mentioned this yet, but you have to start with Kennedy's basic feeling, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, Ted, I don't think I am from my talks with him and yours. He felt that one of the primary responsibilities of the U.S. president in a nuclear age was to avoid war with your major opponent, the Soviet Union, and particularly to avoid nuclear war. And that was always in his mind. And he acted during those 14 days, or 13 days, with that underlying belief. And many of his associates didn't feel that responsibility to the degree he did. And that's why I have felt that had Khrushchev not, on that Sunday, announced over the public radio transmitter he was removing them, because he felt events were slipping out of his control, and they were. I do not believe Kennedy on Monday would have accepted the recommendation of the majority of his advisors to initiate a strike.
Okay.
How long he could have put it off, I don't know, but I don't believe he would have.
Agree or disagree?
No, I strongly agree with that, Bob. John F. Kennedy thought that nuclear war would be the end of everything he believed in and everything he was trying to accomplish as president. The movie mistakenly conveys the notion that on that Saturday, when the messages were being sent out to Khrushchev, that he also said if it doesn't work, then the order is out now that we attack. There was no such order.
There was no order, nor do I think he would have issued it.
Nor do I think he would have issued it. I think he would have found ways of ratcheting up the blockade and imposing the limits on POL. I think he would have found other routes through UTANT at the United Nations to bring the pressure on Khrushchev, but I do not believe he would have ordered attack.
Ernest, disagree?
Nobody can tell if this is removed. Certainly, he wanted to convey to the Soviets a sense that there was a real time limit, that they had to make a decision within 24 hours. Whether, my sense is that he didn't know what he was going to do at that point. But let me just come back a second. One of the services, I think, the movie, I agree, there, as Peter knows, there are various points in which I think the movie's not right. But one crucial point on which it is dead right, and it's better than most of the histories of the missile crisis, is that it makes clear the set of concerns that preyed on Kennedy. And that, because he's been, so many people, historians have taken him to task for insisting on the removal of the missiles from Cuba and saying, well, we could have lived with them, the Soviets lived with our missiles in Turkey and Italy. But what the movie makes clear is that for Kennedy, the central problem was not so much the missiles in Cuba as what happened later, and was his responsibility for the 2.5 million people in Berlin who could only be protected with the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And his concern that if he didn't act as he did with regard to Cuba, he would face the choice of having either to let those people go under essentially Soviet control or use nuclear weapons.
David Gergen, I see sitting here in the audience. You're not part of this act, but you did this for your class the other night. And to Bob's proposition that comes some analogous crisis, and the president says, well, it may leak, it will leak in 36 hours, it gets in the press, so therefore they'll know that we know, so we'll forfeit the opportunity to move first, but let's take time and deliberate and make a thoughtful decision. Have you ever seen a president take such a position in the world now? Maybe if you take a microphone right there, it would be, that way you can hear.
Raise one point about today.
Let me just make this point, because I think Secretary McNamara is on something that's absolutely critical here. And the analogy perhaps comes out of the Carter administration when the Soviets went into Afghanistan. And members of the Carter administration have said subsequently that they woke up that morning finding the Soviets were in Afghanistan and felt that they needed to have a policy response before the 6 o'clock evening news. And they announced a series of steps, including a grain embargo, cancellation of U.S. participation in the Olympics, and others, that in retrospect, they wish so much they had taken an extra day or two to think them through, because they would have made a different set of policy responses. But they felt very intimidated by the cameras and the need to be macho, to show that they were tough enough, which is, of course, the pressure that initially comes. So I think that the clear lesson from both examples is the importance of not being intimidated by the cameras and understanding that the public is not looking for instant answers. What it's looking for is sound judgment. and good policy. And people will wait an extra day or two or a week if that's what it takes. I think that there comes a time when you have to tell the political advisors and the media advisors there are things more important here. And so I think Secretary McNamara is onto something, and Ted Sorensen is something very fundamental. And Ernie May, thanks.
Bob, you want to comment on that point?
I think David is absolutely right. I thought he's the wisest counselor the presidents have had for years, and it just convinces me of that tonight. Now, what he's recommending, or what I recommend, and he's recommending as well, is very, very difficult. You can't imagine the pressure on a president of the world's press. And if the press had headlines, Khrushchev has done what Senator Keating has been saying he'd do. Keating had been, or Republicans had been stating that Khrushchev was going to use Cuba as a base to subvert the hemisphere, weaken us across the world. Now he's done it. Kennedy's sitting in his chair doing nothing. Hours are going by. The missiles are becoming operational. More forces are pouring in, and you're doing nothing, Mr. President. That's a pretty tough environment to deal with. But if your responsibility is to prevent war, particularly to prevent nuclear war, do it. And that is not normally the way we handle crises today.
I will make a slight, I agree with the thrust of the argument, but I just want to disagree in practical terms, I believe. I would wish that could happen, but I've not seen nor have I studied in recent periods an event in which people said, let's take 48 hours to think it over. Indeed, if we were proposing such a course, you would at least have to have a proposition that we announce that we've discovered the missiles, I presume, because otherwise the press is going to announce it. And if you're interested in framing the issue, in order to get the missiles withdrawn without war, the initial framing, who can take the initiative in saying what the shape of the problem is, matters considerably. So I think it's a genuine dilemma. I think it's almost always resolved in favor of shooting before you aim. I think it often with very, very bad consequences.
Well,
I can't think of a case in Clinton, Bush, or Reagan.
What about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait?
The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, good case.
And President Bush said after a number of hours, this will not stand, but he did not say how he planned to change it. And he waited a while to make his decision.
Right, but he did say this will not stand. And
After some prompting from Maggie Thatcher,
yes.
but nonetheless.
but that was within 24 hours, and that was then hard to back off of if he had wanted to do it.
But Kennedy might have said within 24 to 48 hours, this will not stand, without deciding how he would have done it. I thought the Bush response actually gave him time, gave the administration time, and bought some time in a very valuable way.
To deliberate on the
specifics, yeah.
But if I may, I'm not sure your audience understands the situation we, the U.S., are in today with respect to nuclear war. I doubt that you know that we have 7,500 strategic nuclear warheads in our arsenal, and we face 6,500 strategic nuclear warheads in the Russian arsenal. Of our 7,500, 2,500 are on 15-minute alert to be launched, if necessary, under warning. And those 2,500 have a kill capability equal to 50,000 Hiroshima bombs. And the Hiroshima bomb killed 180,000 people. And of the 15-minute warning period before launch, the commander of the Strategic Nuclear Command is allowed 3 rings, the time for 3 rings of the telephone to answer the phone. That's his portion of the 15 minutes. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, he's within 3 rings. Then the remaining 15 minutes is broken down. A, he has to decide whether the warning's reliable. We've had many false warnings. B, if he thinks it's reliable, he has to decide what he's going to recommend to the president. Strike or not strike. And which operational plan to strike on. He has to convey it to the president. The president has to decide what he's going to, he has to consult with whoever the hell he's going to consult with in the remaining 7 or 8 minutes. Then he has to get the football. And any of you who watched Bush's inauguration will remember that after he was sworn in, he stayed on the stage there, as did the others for a while, the inaugural stage, because they were going to go to lunch in the Capitol before the inaugural parade. As he was standing there, a person in blue uniform stepped up next to him. That was an Air Force officer carrying the football. And the reason is that the warheads cannot be activated without an electronic code. The president has the electronic code. He has to be prepared within the 15 minutes to get the code, decide what he's going to do, transmit it to the commander, and the commander launches. Now that's the world we live in. It's insane. And don't you think the president shouldn't say to hell with the press or his media advisor, I'm going to take time to decide what to do. Now I understand all the difficulties of it, but they're not as great as being destroyed by nuclear war.
That seems a pretty strong proposition, and one on which I think we can agree. Let me turn to Peter Allman here, our producer of the film. Peter, there's been a lot of debate, as you've been involved in the press about the film. It's not a documentary, but a dramatization, as you and your co-producers say. Nonetheless, as a dramatization, you had some criteria in mind for authenticity or legitimacy that you were presumably aspiring to. So what criteria do you believe should be used in judging dramatizations of historical events like this one? And with those criteria, it's not fair to let an author review his own book, but how do you think you did?
Well, that's a good place to start. I think we seem to be getting passing grades and then some. But we have taken some very legitimate questions regarding the choices we make. And I would say that it gives me and my colleagues the greatest sense of the kind of limitations of our craft and calling when really distinguished participants in the crisis, such as Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, Theodore Sorensen himself, many of whose comments or statements or functions are kind of subsumed under this O'Donnell point of view character once we'd gone down that road. I'd say that we significantly oversimplify and even do a disservice to a very distinguished public servant, McGeorge Bundy. I think in that case we set up the assistant to the president, Bundy, as a kind of figure with whom O'Donnell is in some kind of conflict, at least in one significant scene. And that is a movie-making moment as opposed to a profound historical insight. It's just not accurate. And my colleagues and I have some real regret about that. It's kind of the horrible oversimplification that the constraints of the movie narrative impose on a project like this. You make some very harsh choices, and key people or key events get left out, or as I say, even at least oversimplified. And then the question becomes, do we address the key issues in the crisis adequately or with any degree of potential insight, and even ideally some inspiration to the audience to really gain some insight into the crisis. And when Professors May, Zelikow, and Allison and others acknowledge that on the big issues we seem to be going down a reasonable road to laying out these questions of presidential judgment and its importance. The fact that David Self's screenplay very artfully weaves in the Berlin issue into the whole fabric of the crisis in a way that other accounts have only touched on in a limited way. That brings us some real satisfaction. And the actual true dangerous nature of the crisis and the fact that it was ratcheting up steadily, that accidents were happening, that U-2s were going off course, that Major Anderson indeed on the terrible night of the 27th of October did get shot down by a SAM missile, and that the entire XCOM was kind of faced with rules of engagement that might have easily moved us to a counterattack circumstance. Well, when we are recognized for getting some of those big themes okay, then I feel we're doing all right. But it is with some real unease that we acknowledge the kind of harsh simplification that goes into this. On one point, I would quarrel, to make a bigger point, I would quarrel with some of our critics who describe us as caricaturing the chiefs. I acknowledge that we have, particularly in the case of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the subtlety and the apparent remarkable diplomatic skills of the chairman are missed. Maxwell Taylor are missed in the film, but I don't think he's caricatured. Whereas I would stand by our portrayal of General LeMay. I think the record bears.
Could have been harsher.
Well, okay. Well, there's a point there. We actually filmed some scenes right off of the tape transcript when the president had left the tape running and the chiefs were in the room kind of fuming about one of the president's decisions or non-decisions, and it got pretty brutal. The language got pretty hot and undiplomatic. Well, it was so over the top when we looked at that scene, we chose to edit it out, and yet it came right out of the tape transcript record. But the point I wanted to make about the military is that the film means to show that the military achievement in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as part of this diplomatic, military, political mix, is an extraordinary demonstration of coercive diplomacy at its finest. That is, the mobilization of the troops, the blockade, the exercise of those engagement, the quarantine, communicated something to the Soviets without taking the actual step of true military engagement. And I think we certainly meant to recognize that extraordinary achievement of the military, though we don't label it as such in the actual dialogue in the course of the movie.
Let me ask Ernie, how would you comment on the same question?
Well, I say, and I do think that for the characters around the XCOM, including Bob and Ted, that people are going to have to go to other sources besides the movie to get a sense of the advice they were really giving and the subtlety of their thought and the interplay with the president. But that's when you dramatize, I think I can understand why it was very hard to do otherwise. On the military, I am critical of the movie. That's the one point in which I am fairly strongly critical of the movie, because it not only it represents the military as having been unitedly hawkish, which they were in their recommendation, though not personally, but the movie represents them as really trying to corner the president, to manipulate the president, to put him in a situation in which he had to do what they wanted him to do. And there certainly were some people in the military establishment who were prepared to do that. Probably General Power was. But I don't think that most of them were. I think most of them were prepared to disagree with the president, but to salute and do their duty. And that's something that I think the movie gives the current generation students who watch it the wrong impression of. But that's, in my mind, overridden by the extent to which it really makes the important points with great emphasis about the dangerousness of the crisis, the importance of presidential leadership, and the nature of the crisis.
Okay. Any comment from Ted or Bob on that one?
Well, I've been, as Peter knows, I've been singing the praises of the movie, even though I think some of its scenes are inaccurate. I think Mac Bundy and Max Taylor, Tommy Thompson, and a couple of others may get shortchanged, and maybe Kenny O'Donnell's inflated just slightly to give credit. But the essential truths of the crisis are portrayed in that movie, and I'm not going to complain about a movie that I think teaches such important lessons.
Good. One of Ted's best lines in, I can't remember where I read it, I think in one of your op-eds or otherwise, is that when asked who would have been his candidate for the everyman that would allow people human entry to the deliberations and sort of inside the mind of the Kennedys, he preferred, rather than Kenny O'Donnell, some person named Ted Sorensen.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
And I agreed with that comment.
No. Thanks, Graham. I actually said to the reporter it was off the record.
Oh, okay.
My God, Ted, you know enough not to do that.
After all these years, you know better than that. Let me get, for people in the audience who want to ask a question, there are 2 microphones here on the floor on either side. And actually, Marsh Carter? Marsh, why don't you get and put a point, because I want to say something about Marsh as we go, if that's okay. And then there's 2 microphones up here on the balcony. Let me start here with Marsh Carter, though, if I can. Marsh has just come to the school as a senior fellow at the Business and Government Center after a distinguished career at State Street. But in the movie and also in the real world of the history, you'll notice that the initial briefings given to the president and to McNamara and Sorensen and others identifying these missiles in Cuba were by a person the movie calls General Carter, who's Marsh's dad. So would you like to make a comment from that angle?
Well, I was a second lieutenant in the Marines during that time, and we were ready to go. But my question would be, at that particular point in history, our intelligence apparatus, with the not having the extensive satellites, having to rely on the U-2s, was not as quick a response. Are you comfortable, either Secretary McNamara, that today we have much quicker response to intelligence around the world than we had 38 years ago?
No question about it. And the same man who was responsible for the U-2 is, in a sense, responsible for that, Dick Bissell.
Okay. And why don't we go here on the left? Please identify yourself. And questions are brief, and 1 question per customer, please.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all for coming. My name is Josh. I'm a sophomore here. For the last 10 years, we've, I guess, sort of had this impression that we are allies with Russia now, the Cold War is over, and the tensions have sort of eased. And yesterday, of course, we learned of the existence of this spy within the FBI, operating for 15 years and giving away some of our deepest secrets and some of our most important secrets. And I guess it's kind of disturbing for us all because it shows just how much some of those tensions really still are there, in a way. How much do you think that matters now that the Cold War is over? And what do you think the chances are that this information that we just learned of could actually lead to, not this particular thing, but the existence of these spies, and it just shows that it's still going on, that there could be tensions in there that could still boil over into something like the Cuban Missile Crisis again in the future?
Well, who would like to take a crack at that?
Well, just one quick anecdotal response, and I'm obviously not expert the way our other panelists are, but I've just returned from Berlin, where we showed the film at the Berlin Film Festival in anticipation of the opening in theaters around Europe. And it's remarkable how much Russian-U.S. tension is back in the air in the newspapers and in the media in Europe as a result of Secretary Rumsfeld's floating the missile shield idea during his meetings in Brussels in the first week of the new administration. And the basic impression is the Europeans just feel very uneasy about new Russian-U.S. tension on the nuclear issue.
The reason I had that slip of the tongue and talked about World War III. It's very, very much on my mind. Another person and I have written a book that begins to deal with it. And one of the primary objectives, I believe, of our foreign policy today should be to avoid war among the great powers, particularly between the U.S. and Russia, or U.S. and Western Europe and Russia, and the U.S. and Japan and China. I don't think we give nearly enough attention to trying to enter the mind of the Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders and try to understand how they look at our actions. And what you said is absolutely correct. Any of you who have traveled in Russia or China in recent months know that they are misinterpreting our actions. They believe that Chinese believe that this missile shield Clinton talked about, much less the one Bush is talking about, is directed to them. Now, I believe it would totally destroy their deterrent, just the deployment of the missiles, ballistic missile defense. But that is not the intention. I absolutely guarantee that was not the intention of Clinton. It will not be the intention of the Chinese. They don't believe it. They believe we bombed that embassy in Belgrade intentionally. I was over there a couple of months ago in China. They said, damn it, McNamara, you boast of being able to put a missile down a smokestack, down a fireplace chimney. And you did. You did it in Belgrade, and you killed 3 people. Who were they? 3 intelligence agents. You did it intentionally. That's absurd. We didn't do it intentionally. They should talk to me about mistakes in the military. But we should try to enter their minds. And we don't.
Okay. The gentleman here, please.
Thank you. Listening especially
Please
to...
identify yourself.
Rob Weisbrod. I teach at Colby College in Maine. Just listening to Mr. McNamara and Mr. Sorensen, I think one has the sense that this supremely dangerous crisis was even more dangerous, if anything, than we knew at the time, given the presence of the tactical nuclear warheads in Cuba. And when you mentioned the likelihood that had President Kennedy ordered an attack on Cuba, those missiles, or perhaps even the strategic missiles, might have been fired. And given what we know that Khrushchev had rescinded any delegation of authority of the tactical warheads, to use the tactical warheads without his express approval during the crisis itself, and given that he understood that the U.S. had some 5,000 warheads, nuclear warheads, to maybe 300 Russian nuclear warheads, I'm curious how you feel this would have gotten out of hand. Even had President Kennedy ordered an attack on Cuba, is it simply that Khrushchev would have lost control of the situation, or would he have simply done something that we would all consider insane? Where would that chain of horrors have led as you see it?
Let me answer. I have never talked to a military commander of any nation who believed that if they had tactical nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have used them, with or without higher approval, number one. Number two, that's particularly true in the case of Khrushchev. Khrushchev had issued orders to General Pliev, the commander of the Soviet forces in Cuba, not to shoot down a U-2. It was shot down, and Khrushchev in his autobiography says, it could not have been shot down by Russian forces because I issued those orders. The Cubans couldn't shoot it down. The only forces that had capability to shoot it down were Russians. They did. You ask, would tactical nuclear weapons have been used in the face of a U.S. invasion? I guarantee you 100% they would have been.
Ted, you want to...
Well, I know, I totally agree. I believe the premise is wrong, that the tactical nuclear forces of the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba did have authority to use them in the event of a U.S. attack. But perhaps the most important is that Khrushchev was the one who had lost control, not Kennedy.
That's
and
correct.
One of the, as brilliant as the letter he received may have been, it was the fact that U-2 had been shot down without his authorizing it that scared him the most.
Events were slipping out of control on both sides.
Up here in the balcony on the right-hand side, please.
Hi, my name is Alan Hassel, and I'm an employee of State Street Bank. I used to work for Marsh. I wanted to ask that earlier you mentioned that Kennedy considered it important to get the missiles out of Cuba because of issues relating to West Berlin, the proximity of those missiles being the main concern. Within a few years, we had submarines off our coast that could launch missiles along the eastern seaboard within about the same time frame, if I'm not mistaken. We had the same thing on the other side. My question is that what changed, and given that, was it so important to get the missiles out of Cuba? And if so, what changed over time?
Very good question.
Well, precisely that argument was made during the first day of our meeting. We've lived on the nuclear bullseye before. Our European allies have been living on the nuclear bullseye for years. Let's just accept it. But here's where there is a difference in the environment from those Soviet submarines, which Bob can tell you more about. I always questioned whether we would have been able to mount a response had Castro and Khrushchev openly, publicly signed a mutual assistance defense treaty under which these missiles were going to be openly placed in Cuba, and over a period of time they were. But it was just the opposite. Instead, Khrushchev used the private channel of communication that he had with Kennedy to lie to Kennedy and assure him that no offensive weapons were being put into Cuba. Several other efforts were made to cover up and lie about this movement of deadly offensive nuclear weapons. That required a response.
And just, you have to realize how much things were changed with the missile crisis, that up to the time of the crisis, Khrushchev was clearly of the view that he had to settle the Berlin issue that year and intended to force a crisis over it in the autumn, in November. After the missile crisis, after that face-off, he recognized that he was really not prepared to face the kind of crisis that would result. And he backed off. He pretended that the whole affair had been about Cuba, not about Berlin. He did not make another demand about Berlin in his time, nor did his successor. The Berlin crisis was resolved by what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay. Gentleman here on the left.
Darrell Farber, I'm a fellow at the Belfer Center. Secretary McNamara, what steps would you take to move us away from nuclear war? What 3 action items would you recommend today?
Well, I recommend, as did the Canberra Commission report, which included as members the former commander of our Strategic Nuclear Command, the former chief of the British Defense Staff, the former Prime Minister of France, a unanimous recommendation by the Canberra Commission to move to elimination of nuclear weapons. I strongly urge that. As the first 2 steps, I'm a Democrat, but as the first 2 steps, I recommend what President Bush has stated publicly he will do. A, to unilaterally reduce that strategic force that I said had 6,500 nuclear warheads in it today, to unilaterally reduce it. And he's pointed toward reducing it to something on the order of 1,000 to 1,500 unilaterally. Now, even if it's only 2,500 reduction, it's a major step forward. To achieve my objective of eliminating it, it's going to take a decade or 2. You've got to develop verifiable means of what the other side is doing. But Bush's proposal to go unilaterally to, I think, certainly below 2,500, I strongly approve. The second point he makes is de-alert. I said there are 2,500 nuclear warheads equivalent to 50,000 Hiroshima bombs on 15-minute alert. For God's sakes, take those off alert. He's publicly stated he proposes to de-alert. I don't know exactly how he proposed to do it. The best way is to separate the warhead from the missile. I hope he will.
Thank you.
On the website that I mentioned earlier, we collected agendas for action that have been identified by lots of different groups. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Managing the Atom Project at the Belfer Center, and dozens of others. And it's a very good place to go look to see that there are concrete actions that actually are relevant now. Let me go to the lady on the left.
Hi, my name is Biana. I'm a freshman at the college. I have a question for those of you that knew President Kennedy, a man that obviously tons and tons has been written about. Is there anything that you wish more people knew, or misconceptions that you feel need to be changed? And also, I'm curious what exactly the role of the football is in in activating the missiles, if that's...
Okay. We usually only have one question per customer, but it's such a good question. Let me see if Ken will answer the first one and Bob the second. What's the function of the football?
I think the May-Zelikow transcripts demonstrate that President Kennedy had leadership qualities that have rarely been matched, at least in this century in the presidency, and which are absolutely essential. During those 13 days, we saw all of those qualities come into play, including, I might add, his sense of humor, even at that very grim time. He could laugh at his own difficulties and the dilemma that we were in. But it was also a sense of history, because he was able to see this in the remarkable context of past wars, and asked us all to take a look at Barbara Tupman's book in that regard. He had an uncanny ability to look at his problems and his country and himself in a very objective way, free from prejudice and sentiment, and try to focus on exactly what was right and what was needed. And he had this incredible curiosity. He wanted to know everything about every country and every leader and every problem in the government at home and abroad. Those are not qualities that we see too often in our presidents.
Thank you.
Okay. On the football, do you want to say just a brief word?
First, let me strongly endorse what Ted has said, and let me also suggest that those of you who haven't seen it should read this Kennedy Institute publication, Presidential Judgment, because it has an essay by Ted which supports the point he made. It also has one by Francis Bator, whom I saw in the audience tonight, on Johnson, and essays on other presidents. Presidential Judgment. It's a fascinating book. But on the football, under the Kennedy and Johnson administration, we redesigned nuclear warheads so they could not be activated by any means other than introducing into it an electronic code. And the code was held by the president. The commander of the Strategic Nuclear Command could not order any of his people to activate a warhead. He didn't have the code. The president did. That's called the football. It's the electronic code that must be introduced into the warhead to activate it.
Just a footnote on your first question, because I think Ted's answer is right on. But if you want to see, particularly as a student, a president as what Neustadt would probably call analyst-in-chief, you can go to the tapes, which Ernie has transcribed, or listened to them actually, out at the library or from the website, on the final Saturday, which the movie I think characterizes rather well, as people feel like they're grappling with an intractable problem and there's basically no way out. And the most remarkable thing to me, and I had studied this crisis 30 years ago and looked at it very carefully, but in listening to the tapes and reading the transcript, is the extent to which the president on that final Saturday really does take over control of the driving of the analytic exercise and go head-to-head with every one of his advisors on topics about which they clearly are much more expert than he, but without flinching. So Tommy Thompson has a view that if you give them an inch, for example, on the Turkish missiles, they'll take a mile. So don't do it. And Kennedy says to him, yeah, but if I don't give them an inch, what will they do? And works down the logic chain step by step by step. McGeorge Bundy says, Mr. President, we see where you're going, because in the end he devises a rather tricky ultimate deal. Okay? We see where you're going with these Turkish missiles. And he says, let me say as firmly as I can, everybody in this government who knows about NATO and the alliance believes that if you compromise at this point on the U.S. missiles in Turkey, you will destroy NATO. Sounds like a pretty decisive argument. And President Kennedy says, and if we have a nuclear war over Cuba, how about NATO? So I have never, in studying a historical incident, found a case in which a president became so self-confidently the analytic driver of an exercise which exposed the hidden assumptions or forced people into the second and third and fourth iteration in the chess game.
Before we leave that, let me just say this. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were militarily obsolete. Everybody in the room, Kennedy and the executive committee, agreed to that. So it wasn't that this was a military requirement. It was, in a sense, a political requirement. NATO will be destroyed or whatever it was. And listen to that tape. It went on for hours. On Saturday, October 27, 1962, basically Kennedy was saying over and over and over again, in opposition to many of his advisors, I'm not going to take this nation to war over a pile of junk. Now that was his feeling. He felt it more strongly than anybody else in the room.
Gentleman here.
I'm David Mingy, and I'm a participant in the Senior Executive Program, State and Local Government here, and a former member of Congress from Minnesota. One thing that surprised me about the movie and about the discussion is the overwhelming support that came from advisors to take a very harsh and aggressive stand with respect to this, and the strength, the character that it took in Kennedy to resist that. And I find this disturbing, and I'm wondering what, if any, lessons we can draw from this with respect to the role of advisors and why they weren't able to take a longer-term perspective on this as the president did, and if we face that same type of problem in making decisions today.
How about Ernest?
Yes, actually, that's when I spoke of my first complaint about the movie, it had to do with how the advisors are represented. Because if you actually listen to the conversations that took place around in the cabinet room and in the Oval Office, they're doing him a much better service than the movie indicates. And there's a lot of wisdom that comes from Bob and Ted and other people who were there. And one of the fascinating things is to see the way in which they listen to each other and they're learning. Now, they're being pushed by the president. The president is guiding this and is the coolest head in the room. But everybody's contributing to this. And it's a remarkable collective exercise, not exclusively an exercise on the part of the president.
Up here in the balcony.
I'm Betsy Horan. I'm a management consultant with Monitor Company. One of the things I found most fascinating in the movie was the theme that you can't apply 40-year-old theories and practices about how to think about negotiations and warfare, et cetera, to that situation. I think it was really well illustrated with a line attributed to Secretary McNamara about the blockade, that this is not a blockade in the traditional sense. This is Kennedy speaking to Khrushchev. So my question is, thinking in that framework, what are the lessons that we should take for today about how we should be thinking about international relations differently from 38 years ago?
A good question. Who's got a short answer?
Maybe this can't be a short answer. I'll make it short, and I'll leave some unanswered questions in your mind. For God's sakes, think about the other guy. Khrushchev had reason, and God knows Castro had reason, to think we were going to invade Cuba and destroy Castro, and in the process, in effect, greatly weaken Khrushchev. If you look at the record, going back into the Eisenhower administration, I didn't believe this for years. Under the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, and the Johnson administration, we sought to assassinate Castro on numerous occasions. We, the Kennedy administration, and I blush to say this, within 60 days or 70 days of inauguration, supported an attempt, the Bay of Pigs, to overthrow Castro by violent action. It was a dismal failure, and many voices in the U.S., responsible voices, certainly not Kennedy, said, by God, we've got to go in with overt U.S. military force to do that. And in Ted's presence and mine, a senior official of the Kennedy administration told the Russians that 2 or 3 years later, several years later, that we actually had, the Kennedy administration had an overt plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Now that's what Castro thought, that's what the Russians thought. I'm not saying that that was the only factor influencing Russia's actions and Castro's actions, but it was a factor. We didn't think of it that way. We ought to think today of the way the other peoples look at us and interpret our actions. We don't.
It's a very, very good short answer. Ernie, very brief? Yeah.
Yes. No, just because your question is what this is long in the past. Can we learn anything from it? Now, if in the movie there are really some wonderfully wise lines. One of which you alluded to, which was the character who plays McNamara saying to somebody who was thinking about this in military terms that it's not a military issue. We're signaling. We're
It
trying
wasn't
to
just the
communicate.
character. I said it.
And one of the others, which I'm told produced a great collective sigh in the White House when this movie was shown there, is when they say, there aren't any wise men, they're just us. And that's something that the movie teaches.
Ernie's referring to the showing that President Bush had of the movie with Senator Kennedy and Kathleen Kennedy Townsend and others. And Kathleen called me a couple of days ago and said that was the moment at which, as you say, not just a sigh, but very uncomfortable laughter. Please, Padre.
Hello, my name's Heidi Gluns. I graduated from the Kennedy School last year. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the role of Bobby Kennedy. I remember reading 13 Days and then kind of comparing that to some of the transcripts from the tapes, and it seemed to be a little bit, the role that he played seemed to differ between the two, so I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, I'd say that everybody's memory is a little selective at times on the role they played. But I think 13 Days by Robert Kennedy is actually quite faithful to the transcripts, omitting the message that was delivered through Ambassador Dubrenin about the NATO missiles in Turkey being out within a matter of months, which is what President Kennedy had always desired, but could not be part of a deal with a gun at our head. I think Bobby Kennedy played a very important role in the crisis. It was Bobby who said that we cannot bomb Cuba without giving some kind of notice, or it's Pearl Harbor in reverse, and try as we could not figure out a form of notice that would not tie us up into knots a lot more than it did the Russians. It was Bobby who was one of those who devised the strategy of largely ignoring the so-called second letter from Khrushchev, the tougher letter increasing the stakes, and responding primarily to the first letter. I think Robert Kennedy played a very important and constructive role in the crisis.
I strongly agree with that, Ted.
We have time for two short answers, two short questions and two short answers. So please, this lady and this gentleman.
Good evening. My name is Linda, and first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. It's been very fascinating listening to you. And I was reading over the bios earlier when you started to speak, and my question is specifically geared towards Mr. McNamara. And it's mentioned your vision for the 21st century for our nation. I was just curious if you could give me a small peek at that.
Your vision for the nation in the 21st century, just what Peter's business would call a trailer.
If you will send me your name and address, I will make sure you receive a copy of a book that's to be published in May that deals directly with this issue, called Wilson's Ghost: How to Avoid the Killing That Occurred in the 20th Century in the 21st.
Will do.
Good. Great. This gentleman gets the final question.
Thank you. My name is Peter Buttigieg. I'm a freshman here at the college. I have a sort of historical question for Mr. Sorensen. There's this great scene toward the end of the movie where you're in the bathroom with Kenny O'Donnell shaving, and you've been asked to write two speeches, one which is actually used and one in the event that there are airstrikes. And you're explaining that you can't even imagine how you would have explained airstrikes. I realize that's probably quite a dramatization, but I wonder, as someone who studies both history and politics, if you dared to prepare a way to explain airstrikes and how you would have gone about doing that.
Well, that's a very interesting question. the movie actually oversimplifies what actually happened. And it is true that I, having originally been instructed to write 2 speeches, one for each of the 2 major courses we were considering, only wrote 1. But it's really a drafting job within a drafting job because of the need for notice before we bombed. The instructions were, come up with a letter to Khrushchev to be delivered by a personal emissary from the president that will prevent him from immediately reacting, pressing some button or signaling that the missiles be aimed at us, that will make it impossible for him to avoid or evade giving a prompt answer, that will be assure that the answer is one that he will withdraw the missiles or else, and that is not in any way an ultimatum that the world and history would condemn us for. And I did go back to my office, and I failed to write that.
Ted, as you described that so well, I could see a number of students looking and thinking, gee, this sounds like my assignment last night. But for joining us for this remarkable occasion, I want to say thank you very much, especially to the guests who came from a distance, Bob McNamara, Ted Sorensen, and Peter Allman. If you want to hear more about this, tomorrow night on McNeil Lair, there's McNamara and Allman, and we look forward to the next event here, which is Tom Brokaw next week. Thank you very much.
That was pretty good fun.
That's a great conclusion.